The conference room fell silent as she walked in. Every eye in the Pentagon briefing room turned toward the woman in the crisp black suit. Her auburn hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her stride confident and measured. She carried herself like someone who had seen the world's darkest corners and emerged stronger for it. Commander Jake Morrison had been staring at his briefing notes when the whispers started. 23 years in the Navy SEALs had taught him to notice everything. But something about the sudden shift in the room's energy made him look up. That's when he saw her. The blood drained from his face. "Who is she?" Someone whispered behind him. But Jake couldn't turn around. Couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. It wasn't her face that stopped his world, though those green eyes were unmistakable. Even after 8 years. It wasn't the way she commanded attention without saying a word. Though that hadn't changed either. It was the small patch of skin visible just above her collar, where her jacket had shifted slightly as she reached for her briefcase. A tattoo. Small, delicate, barely an inch across. Most people would miss it completely. But Jake Morrison was not most people. And this was not just any tattoo. It was a compass rose, intricate and beautiful, with tiny coordinates etched beneath it in numbers so small they were barely visible. Coordinates that Jake knew by heart. Coordinates that marked a place neither of them should have survived. His hands began to shake. The woman, Agent Sarah Chen, according to the nameplate being set in front of her, took her seat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. She moved with the same fluid grace he remembered. But there was something harder about her now. Something that spoke of years spent in shadows, making impossible choices. She hadn't seen him yet. Her attention was focused on the stack of classified folders being distributed around the table, her fingers drumming silently against the polished wood. It was a habit, he remembered. She used to do that when she was thinking, planning, calculating risks that could mean the difference between life and death. The Secretary of Defense cleared his throat, calling the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Today's briefing concerns Operation Nightfall, a joint task force initiative that will require the cooperation of multiple agencies." Jake forced himself to focus on the words, but his mind was spinning. How was she here? She was supposed to be dead. They all were supposed to be dead. The entire team. The mission that didn't exist, in the country they were never supposed to enter, fighting enemies that officially didn't exist. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. 8 years, 3 months, and 17 days ago. The coordinates under her tattoo weren't just any location. They marked the exact spot where everything had gone wrong, where their unit had been ambushed, where Jake had watched 12 good soldiers die in a valley that didn't appear on any map, where he had cradled her broken body in his arms as helicopters burned around them and promised her things would be okay, even as her blood soaked through his tactical vest, where he had been forced to leave her body behind. But she was sitting 20 feet away from him, alive and breathing, and wearing a tattoo that marked their shared nightmare like a badge of honor. Agent Chen, the secretary continued, will be leading the intelligence-gathering portion of this operation. Her experience in deep cover operations makes her uniquely qualified for this assignment. Deep cover operations. Jake's jaw tightened. What kind of deep cover operation required you to fake your own death? And why hadn't anyone told him she was alive? She began to speak, her voice carrying that same calm authority he remembered. The target is a network of arms dealers operating out of Eastern Europe. Our intelligence suggests they've acquired military-grade weapons that pose a direct threat to American interests abroad. Professional. Controlled. Nothing in her tone suggested she knew he was in the room. But Jake caught the slight pause, when her eyes swept past his section of the table. Just a fraction of a second, but he saw it. She knew he was there. The briefing continued for another hour. Maps were displayed. Target photographs were passed around. Mission parameters were outlined with surgical precision. Jake participated when required, asked the right questions, made the appropriate observations. But his mind remained fixed on that tattoo, and what it meant. When the meeting finally ended, Jake remained seated as the room emptied. Sarah Agent Chen was gathering her files methodically, her movements precise and unhurried. She was one of the last to leave. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. She was almost to the door when he found his voice. "The coordinates are wrong." She stopped. Didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Excuse me?" Her voice was carefully neutral. Jake walked toward her, each step feeling like he was crossing a minefield. "The tattoo. The coordinates. They're off by about 30 meters. We weren't in the valley when it happened. We were on the ridge." Now she turned. Those green eyes met his, and for just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped. He saw recognition there, pain, and something else. Something that looked almost like relief. "Commander Morrison." She said his name like she was testing it, seeing how it felt on her tongue after all these years. "I wondered when you'd notice." "Notice?" Jake's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Sarah, I thought you were dead. We all did. There was a funeral. Your name is on the memorial wall. Your parents." He stopped, remembering the grief in her mother's eyes at the service. "Had to believe I was dead for this to work." Her voice softened slightly, but her posture remained rigid. It was the only way. "Well, Eleman. Well, had to one. Wellman have 1710. Eleman. The only way for what?" She glanced around the empty conference room, then back at him. "To find out who sold us out." The words hit him like a physical blow. Jake staggered back a step. "What are you talking about? That ambush wasn't random, Jake. Someone gave them our location, our route, our timeline. Someone with access to classified information set us up to die." Her eyes hardened again. "And I've spent the last 8 years finding out who." Jake's mind raced. The ambush had always bothered him. Too perfectly timed. Too well coordinated. The enemy had known exactly where to position themselves for maximum impact. But the alternative that someone in their own government had betrayed them was too terrible to consider. "You're certain?" "I have proof." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "And the person responsible is going to be at the next briefing." "Who?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a photograph. It showed a man in military uniform, decorated and distinguished. Someone, Jake, recognized immediately. Someone who had been in this very room an hour ago. "That's impossible," Jake whispered. "The coordinates on my tattoo aren't wrong, Jake. They mark the spot where I buried the evidence. The real evidence. Not the sanitized version in the official reports." She tucked the photograph away. "I've been planning this moment for 8 years. Everything I've done, every identity I've assumed, every mission I've completed, it's all been leading up to this." Jake stared at her, seeing the woman he had once known overlaid with the stranger she had become. "You could have told me. Could have trusted me." 8. I did trust you." Her voice was barely audible now. "You're the only one who knew about the tattoo. The only one who would understand what those coordinates really meant. Why do you think I made sure you'd be assigned to this task force?" The realization hit him like a cold wave. "You arranged this. I needed someone I could trust when the time came. Someone who knew the truth about what happened in that valley." She gathered her remaining files. "And that time is coming sooner than you think." She headed for the door again, then paused. "Jake, the reason I had to stay dead was because they tried to kill me twice after the valley. Once in a hospital in Germany, once at a safe house in Virginia. It took me a long time to realize that someone very powerful wanted to make sure I never told anyone what really happened that day." Sarah, wait. But she was gone, leaving Jake alone in the empty conference room with more questions than answers, and the terrible knowledge that the nightmare he thought he'd left behind in Afghanistan was far from over. Outside the Pentagon, Sarah walked to her car with steady steps, but her hands were shaking as she unlocked the door. Seeing Jake again had been harder than she'd expected. For 8 years, she had trained herself not to think about him, not to remember the way he had held her, as she drifted in and out of consciousness in that blood-soaked valley. Not to wonder if he had moved on, found someone else, built the life they had talked about during those long nights on guard duty. She had work to do, justice to serve, a traitor to expose. But as she drove away from the Pentagon, she allowed herself one moment to remember what it felt like to see recognition and concern in someone's eyes, instead of the careful neutrality she had grown accustomed to. For 8 years, she had been a ghost, a shadow, a dozen different identities serving a single purpose. For 30 seconds in that conference room, she had been Sarah Chen again, and it had felt like coming home. Sarah Chen had always been good at being invisible, but becoming dead had required an entirely different skill set. The transition from Navy intelligence officer to non-existent ghost had happened in stages, each more carefully orchestrated than the last. The first stage had been the hardest part, lying motionless in a medical tent in Kandahar, while Jake Morrison held her hand and whispered promises he couldn't keep. She had been conscious for most of it. But the doctors hadn't known. The combination of blood loss and shock medication had left her in a state that perfectly mimicked unconsciousness. She had heard every word Jake spoke to her, felt every tear that fell onto her face. She had also heard Colonel Richard Hawthorne giving orders outside the tent. "Make sure she doesn't make it to Germany," he had said to someone in a voice barely above a whisper. "Too many complications. If she starts talking about what she saw. Even lying there dying, Sarah had known what he meant. In the chaos of the ambush, while her team was being systematically slaughtered, she had spotted something that didn't belong. A figure on a distant ridge, too far away to be one of the enemy fighters, holding what looked like military-grade radio equipment. Someone had been coordinating the attack, but it wasn't until she had seen the man's face through her scope that she understood the true scope of the betrayal. Colonel Marcus Webb, their commanding officer, the man who had planned their mission route and timeline, the man who had sent them into that valley, knowing exactly what was waiting for them. The medical evacuation to Germany had been her opportunity. While being transferred from the helicopter to the trauma unit, Sarah had managed to slip away during the controlled chaos of a medical emergency. It hadn't been difficult in her condition. Most people assumed she was already dead. A stolen nurse's uniform, forged paperwork, and 24 hours later, she had ceased to exist. The next 2 years had been spent learning how to be someone else. The CIA had programs for that sort of thing, though they didn't usually recruit from their own apparent casualties. Sarah had approached them through intermediaries, offering information about arms trafficking networks in exchange for a new identity and the resources to investigate what had happened to her unit. Agent Sarah Chen, intelligence analyst, had been born in a small office in Langley, Virginia. Her fingerprints had been altered. Her dental records had been modified. Her DNA had been scrubbed from every database that mattered. For all official purposes, the woman who had nearly died in that valley had never existed, but the coordinates tattooed on her chest reminded her every day who she really was. The investigation had taken her across 3 continents. Webb had been careful, but not perfect. Over the years, Sarah had traced payments from offshore accounts to known terrorist organizations. She had documented meetings between American military officers and arms dealers. She had watched from shadows as weapons purchased with U.S. taxpayer dollars were sold to the highest bidders, regardless of their intentions. The Valley ambush hadn't been about eliminating her unit. It had been about eliminating witnesses to a much larger operation. Colonel Webb had been running his own private war economy, selling military intelligence and equipment to anyone willing to pay. The ambush had been designed to silence the one team that had gotten too close to his operation. But he hadn't counted on Sarah surviving. And he certainly hadn't counted on her spending 8 years building an airtight case against him. Now Webb was a general. He had been promoted twice since the Valley, his career enhanced by his successful counter-terrorism operations in Afghanistan. He was scheduled to testify before Congress next month about military efficiency and cost reduction. The media loved him. The Pentagon trusted him. And tomorrow, he would be in the same room as Sarah for the first time since he had ordered her death. Jake Morrison had always been a light sleeper, but the nightmares made rest almost impossible. He had been staring at the ceiling of his Arlington apartment for 3 hours when his secure phone rang. The number was blocked, but he knew who it would be. "We need to talk." Sarah's voice was calm. "Professional. Somewhere. Private. My place isn't secure enough for whatever you want to discuss. Not your place. Do you remember the diner where we used to go after training exercises? The one with the terrible coffee?" Jake smiled despite himself. "Murphy's. On Route 50. But that was 8 years ago, Sarah. It might not even. It's still there. Midnight. The line went dead. Murphy's diner looked exactly the same as it had 8 years ago, slightly run down, perpetually empty, and serving coffee that could dissolve metal. Jake arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner booth that gave him clear sightlines to all entrances. Old habits. Sarah walked in precisely at midnight, wearing jeans and a leather jacket that made her look more like the woman he remembered and less like the government agent she had become. She slid into the booth across from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You look tired," she said finally. "You look alive." Jake's attempt at humor fell flat. "Still getting used to that." "See, Jake, R." She ordered coffee from the elderly waitress, then pulled a tablet from her jacket. "I'm going to show you something, but first I need to know, do you trust me?" "I trusted you enough to be here." "That's not the same thing." Jake looked at her, really looked at her. The years had changed her, but not in the ways he might have expected. She was harder, more controlled, but there was something in her eyes that remained unchanged. The same fierce determination that had made her the best intelligence officer in their unit. "Yeah," he said quietly. Sarah activated the tablet and turned it toward him. The screen showed a series of financial records, bank transactions, and communication intercepts. "This is what I've been building for 8 years." Jake studied the data. Account numbers from Swiss banks. Wire transfers to shell companies in Eastern Europe. Communications between U.S. military personnel and known arms dealers. The scope of it was staggering. "How much money are we talking about? Over the past 5 years?" "Approximately $200 million. Sarah swiped to the next screen. "Weapons, intelligence, logistical support, all sold to the highest bidder. And you're saying Webb is behind all of this?" "I'm not saying it. I'm proving it." She showed him a series of intercepted communications. "These are encrypted messages between Webb and his contacts. I've been monitoring his communications for 3 years." Jake read the messages, his expression growing darker with each one. "He sold information about our patrol routes. Not just ours, dozens of units over the past decade. Every ambush that seemed too well coordinated. Every mission that went sideways for inexplicable reasons. Webb had his fingers in all of it. The valley was just the beginning. The valley was cleanup. We had stumbled onto something, and he needed us eliminated before we could report it." Sarah pulled up another file. "This is the after-action report Webb filed about our mission." Jake read it quickly. According to Webb's account, their unit had been sent to investigate reports of weapons smuggling. They had encountered unexpected enemy resistance and suffered heavy casualties. Standard military operation gone wrong. None of this is what actually happened. We weren't there to investigate weapons smuggling, Jake. We were there to provide security for one of Webb's deals. We just didn't know it." Sarah's voice was steady, but he could hear the anger underneath. "He used us as unwitting muscle for his operation, then had us killed. When the deal went bad." Jake set down the tablet. "How did you get all this information?" "Carefully, patiently, and with help from people who care more about justice than careers." She hesitated. "There are others in the intelligence community who suspected something was wrong. It took me years to find them and convince them to help." "Others like Colonel Hawthorne?" Sarah's expression hardened. "Hawthorne knew. He was Webb's liaison with the medical units. Made sure that witnesses to sensitive operations didn't make it to places where they could talk. How many people has he killed? We're not sure. But we have evidence linking him to at least 17 suspicious deaths over the past decade. All military personnel who had access to sensitive information. All died from complications during medical treatment. Jake felt sick. This goes all the way up the chain of command. Not all the way, but far enough. Sarah closed the tablet. Webb has been careful to insulate himself with layers of trusted subordinates. Most of the people involved probably don't even know the full scope of what they're participating in. But you do. I've made it my life's work to know. She looked out the window at the empty parking lot. Tomorrow's briefing isn't really about a new operation, Jake. It's about ending an old one. You're going to expose him publicly. I'm going to present evidence that will result in his immediate arrest and court-martial, along with Hawthorne and 6 other officers who have been part of his network. Sarah turned back to him. But I need backup. Someone I can trust to watch my back when everything goes sideways. And you think it will go sideways? I know it will. Webb has too much to lose and too many resources to go quietly. She reached across the table and touched his hand. I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. Jake looked down at their joined hands. Her skin was warm, real, alive. For 8 years, he had carried the weight of leaving her behind in that valley. The guilt had nearly destroyed him. What do you need me to do? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the conference room. Just be ready to move when I give the signal. And Jake, wear your sidearm to the briefing. Expecting trouble? Counting on it. She stood to leave, then paused. There's something else you should know. About why I chose those particular coordinates for the tattoo. Jake waited. It's not just where we were ambushed. It's where I buried a backup drive with copies of all my evidence. If something happens to me tomorrow, if Webb manages to silence me permanently, you'll need to retrieve it. She gave him a set of GPS coordinates, different from the ones in her tattoo. The tattoo was misdirection. In case anyone noticed it, the real evidence is buried 30 meters south of where my tattoo says it is. Sarah. I'm not planning to die tomorrow, Jake. But I've learned not to leave things to chance. She placed money on the table for her untouched coffee. See you at the briefing. After she left, Jake sat alone in the empty diner for another hour, processing everything she had told him. The scope of the betrayal was almost incomprehensible. How many soldiers had died because of Webb's greed? How many operations had been compromised? How many families had lost loved ones to fund his secret war economy? But underneath his anger and disgust was something else. Relief. Sarah was alive. After 8 years of guilt and regret, she was alive and strong and fighting for justice. Whatever happened tomorrow, he wouldn't let her face it alone. He drove home through the empty Virginia streets, already planning what he would need to do. Check his weapon. Review the building's layout. Identify escape routes and potential threats. Tomorrow, one way or another, the truth about what happened in that valley 8 years ago would finally come to light. And Jake Morrison would be ready when it did. The Pentagon conference room felt different the next morning. Jake noticed it the moment he walked in, subtle changes that suggested heightened security. Additional personnel positioned near the exits, metal detectors that hadn't been there the day before. The kind of precautions that meant someone important was expecting trouble. General Marcus Webb entered the room at precisely 0800 hours. His uniform immaculate. His bearing commanding. He had aged well over the past 8 years. His hair now silver at the temples. His chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career. To anyone looking at him, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a dedicated military officer who had served his country with honor. Jake knew better now. Sarah Agent Chen arrived 5 minutes later, carrying the same briefcase as before. She took her seat at the opposite end of the table from Webb, her expression neutral and professional. But Jake caught the slight tension in her shoulders. The way her eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and positions. She was ready for war. The Secretary of Defense called the meeting to order. Before we continue with Operation Nightfall planning, General Webb has requested time to address some concerns about intelligence leaks that may affect the operation. Webb stood slowly, his movements deliberate and confident. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Unfortunately, we have reason to believe that classified information has been compromised. We've identified a security breach that requires immediate attention. He activated the room's projection system, displaying what appeared to be surveillance photographs. Jake's blood turned to ice when he recognized the images Sarah meeting with various individuals over the past several months, entering government buildings, accessing secure facilities. Agent Chen, Webb continued, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command, has been conducting unauthorized intelligence-gathering operations that violate multiple federal statutes. We believe she may be working with foreign agents to compromise American military operations. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Several officials reached for their phones, probably to call security. But Sarah remained perfectly calm, as if she had expected this exact scenario. That's a serious accusation, General, the secretary said. Agent Chen, how do you respond? Sarah stood slowly, her briefcase in hand. I respond by presenting evidence of treason, conspiracy, and murder that reaches to the highest levels of military command. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a stack of folders, distributing them around the table with methodical precision. What you're looking at is 8 years' worth of documented evidence proving that General Webb has been selling military intelligence and weapons to terrorist organizations and arms dealers. Webb's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous beneath. This is clearly a desperate attempt by a compromised agent to deflect attention from her own crimes. The financial records are fake, Sarah continued, ignoring his protests. The communications intercepts are fabricated. The photographic evidence is doctored. She moved to the projection system and inserted her own drive. But this isn't. Rive. The screen filled with images of Webb meeting with known arms dealers. Bank records showing payments from offshore accounts. Communications intercepts with timestamps and encryption keys that proved their authenticity. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and absolutely genuine. 8 years ago, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. General Webb ordered the elimination of my unit because we had discovered his illegal arms-dealing operation. 12 soldiers died in that ambush. I survived, but Webb believed I was dead. He's been operating under that assumption ever since. Webb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is preposterous. Agent Chen is clearly mentally unstable, probably suffering from PTSD related to her combat service. None of this evidence is admissible. Actually, it is. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. Because it was gathered as part of a joint CIA-FBI investigation that began 3 years ago. Everything you see here has been verified by multiple intelligence agencies. She pressed a button on her tablet, and the conference room doors opened. FBI agents in tactical gear entered from both ends, their weapons drawn but pointed toward the floor. The lead agent stepped forward, badge visible. General Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. For a moment, Webb stood frozen, his mind probably calculating options and escape routes. Then his hand moved toward his service weapon. Jake was already in motion. 8 years of training kicked in as he lunged across the table, tackling Webb before he could draw his sidearm. They hit the floor hard, Webb's superior rank meaning nothing in the face of Jake's younger reflexes and burning desire for justice. It's over, sir, Jake said, pinning the general's arms behind his back. It's finally over. As the FBI agents secured Webb and began reading him his rights, Sarah walked over to where Jake was getting to his feet. Her professional mask had finally slipped, and he could see exhaustion in her eyes, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had carried a terrible burden for too long. Thank you, she said quietly. Thank you for staying alive. The aftermath took hours. Statements were given. Evidence was catalogued. Webb was led away in handcuffs, along with Colonel Hawthorne and 3 other officers who had been arrested simultaneously at different locations around the country. The network that had operated for over a decade was finally exposed. Jake and Sarah found themselves in a small office adjoining the conference room, waiting to be debriefed by FBI investigators. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the fact that it was finally over. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking more relaxed than he had seen her since she walked back into his life. "Now I testify at Webb's court-martial, help the FBI track down the rest of his network, make sure every family who lost someone because of his greed gets the truth they deserve." And after that, she was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I've spent 8 years planning for this day. I'm not sure what comes next." Jake turned to face her fully. "Sarah Chen is officially dead. What name are you using now?" One. Several, depending on the situation. "But for legal purposes, I'm Catherine Martinez." She smiled. "The CIA was very thorough when they created my new identity. Do you miss being Sarah Chen?" "Every day." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't be her and do what needed to be done." Sarah Chen was a Navy intelligence officer who followed orders and trusted the chain of command. Catherine Martinez is someone who learned that sometimes you have to break the rules to serve justice. "And which one are you now?" Sarah considered this for a moment. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe I'm someone new. Someone who doesn't have to choose between duty and conscience anymore." An FBI agent appeared in the doorway, ready to take their formal statements. But before they stood to follow him, Sarah touched Jake's arm. "The coordinates I gave you last night, you should still go retrieve that evidence. Not because we need it for Webb's prosecution, but because there are other things buried there. Personal things. Letters I wrote but never sent. Thoughts I couldn't share with anyone. Letters to who? To you. To my parents. To the families of the soldiers who died, because I couldn't save them." She stood slowly. "Maybe it's time to dig up the past and finally let it rest." 3 weeks later, Jake found himself standing in a valley in Afghanistan, holding a GPS unit and a tactical shovel. The military had granted him emergency leave to resolve personal matters related to classified operations, bureaucratic speak for finding closure. The coordinates led him to a spot on a ridge overlooking the valley where their unit had been ambushed. It was a barren, wind-swept place that showed no signs of the violence that had occurred there 8 years ago. Nature had a way of healing itself, even in the harshest environments. He found the cache buried 3 feet down, sealed in a military-grade waterproof container. Inside were hard drives, documents, photographs, and a stack of letters written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. The letter addressed to him was dated 2 years after the ambush. "Jake, if you're reading this, it means I succeeded in exposing Webb, or I died trying and someone followed the trail I left behind. Either way, the truth is finally out there. I want you to know that surviving when everyone else died has been the hardest thing I've ever done. But knowing that their deaths might serve a greater purpose, that justice might finally be served, has kept me going. You held my hand in that valley and promised me everything would be okay. It took 8 years. But you were right. Everything is okay now. I hope you can forgive me for letting you think I was dead. I hope you can understand why it had to be that way. And I hope that someday, when all of this is over, we can find our way back to being the people we were before the world taught us that sometimes the greatest act of service is learning when to disobey orders. With love and respect, Sarah." Jake sat on the ridge for a long time, watching the sun set over the valley where so many good people had died. But for the first time in 8 years, he felt something other than guilt and regret. He felt peace. His secure phone rang as he was preparing to leave. "Jake?" Sarah's voice was clear despite the distance. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Yeah, I found it." "Good. I have something to tell you. The FBI offered me a position, heading up a new task force focused on military corruption. It's based in Washington. Regular hours, mostly. A chance to be Catherine Martinez officially, with benefits and everything. That sounds good. You deserve a normal life. There's just one problem. Catherine Martinez doesn't have anyone to have dinner with on Friday nights. And it turns out that after 8 years of being alone, the thought of normal life is a little terrifying. Jake smiled, looking out over the valley one last time. Well, I know a guy who's pretty good at handling terrifying situations. He might be available for dinner. Just dinner? For starters. We've got a lot of catching up to do. I'd like that. Jake? Yeah? Welcome home. As Jake made his way down from the ridge, he carried with him not just the evidence that would ensure Webb's conviction, but something more valuable. The knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from following orders, but from following conscience. That justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that some bonds forged in fire are strong enough to survive even death itself. The valley fell silent behind him, its secrets, finally, at rest. But ahead lay Washington, and Sarah, and the possibility of building something good from the ashes of betrayal and loss. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worthwhile ever was. But for the first time in 8 years, Jake Morrison was looking forward instead of back. And somewhere in Virginia, a woman who had been called many names over the years was learning how to be herself again, one careful step at a time.